Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, after 7 years in the making, the Chilcot inquiry into the Iraq War was finally published this time last year. It made rather uncomfortable reading for Tony Blair. Now, a year on, John Chilcot spoke exclusively to the BBC's Laura Kunsberg about the report, and yet again, Mr. Blair is likely to be feeling uneasy about what he has to say. Excuse me. The Iraq inquiry was announced in 2009 by the then Prime Minister Gordon Brown with the remit to identify the lessons that can be learned. Among the findings, the report found that military action was, in fact, not the last resort, and other peaceful means could have been tried first. The inquiry went on to say in March 2003, Saddam Hussein was not an imminent threat, arguing the intelligence had not established beyond doubt that Iraq had continued to produce chemical weapons, and that the legal basis for military action was far from satisfactory. In terms of the aftermath of the war, the inquiry found the planning, the preparations, wholly inadequate. Speaking exclusively to the BBC today, John Chilcot said Tony Blair was not straight with the nation. That's the key quote about his decision to go to war, and argued that the former Prime Minister made the case pinning it on belief, not on fact. So there we go. Let's take a quick look at some of Laura's interview.
I hesitate to say this rather, but I think it was, from his perspective and standpoint, emotionally truthful. And I think that came out also in his press conference after the launch statement. I think he was under very great emotional pressure during those sessions, far more than the committee were. He was suffering, he was deeply engaged. Now, in that state of mind and mood, you fall back on your instinctive skills and reactions, I think.
But he was relying, you suggest, therefore, on emotion, not fact.
Both.
And I'm joined now by Conservative MP John Barron. He voted against the Iraq War in the Commons. And Matthew Doyle, former Special Advisor to Tony Blair when he was Prime Minister. Welcome to you both. Let me come to you first, John Barron. This key quote, the one that makes the headlines, quote, "not straight with the nation," referring to Tony Blair. Many people will be watching this and say, well, why didn't Chilcot say this at the time?
Well, in a way he did. I mean, he made it very clear in his report that the peaceful options had not been exhausted at the time before committing troops to war. And given that committing troops to war is the most serious act a Parliament can take, many of us said there was not enough evidence there at the time, which is why a good number of us voted against.
But did he pull his punches the way Robin Butler did when his report came out? Or at least he said, oh, you asked the wrong questions, or I'd have given you straighter answers. Is this a typical senior British civil servant, wants to have it both ways? Well, does a report, but doesn't make too many waves, then a year later gives the killer quote. I mean, I would suggest if that quote had come out of the time, the report would be much more devastating.
Well, I think the report, personally, I think the report is devastating anyway. If you read the report at the time, which we all did, it was very clear that despite perhaps good intentions, the fact is there was not evidence there. We went to war on a false premise. Sir John Chilcot made this point that all peaceful options had not been exhausted, and there was then the shambles afterwards. Now, that's all laid out in the report. Okay. Maybe Sir John Chilcot believes that he needs to clarify that, but for many of us, it was there in black and white.
It's only taken him a year. Who knows what he'll come out with next year? Not straight with the nation. That's the damning criticism.
Well, it's the bit that you've chosen to take out of the interview to run this as a story today.
You?
Well, because what you could also do is look at the fact that he also said in the same interview that Tony Blair hadn't, quote, departed from the truth. You could have chosen that as your headline to run instead. You could have referred to what he said at the liaison committee in November 2016 when he said that he absolved Tony Blair from any charge of misleading either Parliament or the public.
So what does he mean then by not straight with the nation? Is he saying two things at the same time? time
Well, I think-
that are contradictory.
I think what he's saying today, if you look at what he's saying, is he is talking much more about the style than the substance, and the way in which that Tony Blair addressed the hearings. He referred there in that clip you played to the emotions of it. And it's hardly surprising that an elected politician is going to take a different approach to these things than a senior civil servant. But on the point of substance, the actual thing that we've learned from the Chilcot interview is that Tony Blair went to the chair of the Joint Intelligence Committee on the eve of war and said, is this beyond reasonable doubt? And the chair of the Joint Intelligence Committee said it was, and John Chilcot, in your interview today, says Tony Blair was entitled to believe that.
Indeed, and I've got the full quote here. He went to the chair of the Joint Intelligence Committee, the most senior intelligence officer in this country. Can you tell me, Mr. Blair says, beyond any reasonable doubt that Saddam has weapons of mass destruction? To which the answer was, yes, I can. And even Chilcot says he was entitled to rely on that.
Yes, but let's be absolutely clear about this. We went to war on a false premise. There were no weapons of mass destruction.
That may be because the Jake in the head of it got it wrong.
Well, that may be the case, but we also need to look at the evidence that was presented to us at the day on the day. We all remember the dodgy dossier and the evidence, or lack of it. There was a lack of concrete evidence with regards to WMD. It's as simple as that.
But that's not what the head of the Joint Intelligence Committee told him. Now,
Well,
clearly the head of the Joint Intelligence Committee was wrong, but you can't blame Tony Blair for that.
Well, you ask questions that you want a positive answer to in some respects, and you go hunting for those answers to a certain extent as well.
So you're saying that our most senior intelligence officer at the time simply told Mr. Blair what he wanted to hear?
What I'm saying is if you looked at what evidence that exchange was based on, that what evidence that was actually there available to the intelligence services, it was not enough to make the case for war. And for many of us, we looked at that evidence in very close detail. There was hardly any there, Andrew. The spin doctors had a field day on this.
I mean, it's simply not true. I'm sorry, it's simply not true to say that there was no evidence. There was an international consensus at the time that Saddam had an active WMD program. Now, sadly, we know that tragically turned out not to be the case. But if you look at let's focus on the substance of the report here, rather than trying to yet again sort of start with, conspiracy theories about what was agreed when and all the rest of it. Let's look at the fundamentals.
Of course, I don't think we've mentioned any of that this morning.
Let's look at the fundamentals of the report. The things that haven't changed. Volume 1 concludes that there was no secret deal in April 2002. Volume 4 concludes that the intelligence wasn't used in a false or a misleading way. Volume 5 says that the Cabinet was not deceived or misled in this process. Let's actually focus on the substance here, and let's have a genuine lessons learned exercise.
Well, let us look at the evidence. I mean, the United Nations at the end of the day made it very clear, and John Chilcot referred to this, that they weren't going to give a carte blanche. They wanted the arms inspectors to do their time and actually complete their role, which they never did, of course, and they couldn't find the WMD because they weren't there. So
but the UN didn't claim at the time there was no WMD.
What they did ask, though, for, Andrew, is more time.
But that's the job of the UN, isn't it?
Well, it is, but at the end of the day, you've got to base your interventions on some sort of legitimacy. Otherwise, we're going to be living in a, we're going to be, living in a world where you just intervene.
But hold on, whether it was right or wrong, or at least whether Mr. Blair really believed there was WMD or not. Surely the two.
Well, hang on a minute. You can't just dismiss that. We know for a fact that the statements were truthful at the time.
Well, though they turned out not to be true. I mean, he may have believed them to be true. Only he knows that.
That is an important distinction,
we can't
Andrew.
see into his.
That is not semantics.
No, I said whether he thought or not, whether he really believed or not. The fact is, two facts matter. One is there was no WMD, and secondly, we had no real preparations for rebuilding a country that we were invading, which in a sense seems to me actually, my own view, that's a more damning criticism, because you could have done something, you could be genuinely wrong about WMD, but you cannot invade a place. I mean, when you look at the plans this country made with America for the rebuilding of Germany after 1945, it was all made only a mile from here. Surely it's clear it was wrong in the end.
Yes,
it was wrong.
There's no question about that. But I think what this comes back to, well, there was clearly a failure in the planning. I mean,
the invasion was wrong.
Well, that's a different argument as to whether you believe it was right to get rid of Saddam Hussein and his two sons, and whether the problem problem with these situations is there is always a consequence not to taking action as well. Let's look at the different examples. Libya, where we did something. Syria, where we've done nothing. Iraq, where we've done a lot. You know, you can look at all of these examples and draw different...
Well, I'll come back to these in a minute, see what the lessons are, but what do you say to
just
that,
very
John
briefly,
Barr? And then I want to
in
hear
all those
from
interventions, you could argue that we failed because we haven't failed to create a stable democracy, and liberal interventionism actually hasn't worked. But put those interventions to one side, let's concentrate on the matter Iraq. The simple fact of the matter is the evidence was exceptionally thin. This was reflected in the United Nations, who were urging caution because their weapons inspectors hadn't been given enough time. We were marching to American military timetable, and there were no WMD, and the follow-through was a complete and utter disaster. We should have learnt the lessons of 1945 Germany. Instead, we disbanded the infrastructure, and basically the whole country went into a shambles.
Let me bring John Mills in here, because people on both sides of this argument are always on lessons to be learned. But as I stand back and I look at Iraq, where we intervened and occupied, a mess. I look at Libya, we intervened but didn't occupy, a mess. I look at Syria, we haven't really intervened and we haven't occupied, a mess. What are the lessons?
Well, I think it's very difficult to draw any very firm conclusions about what the best thing to do is in these circumstances. I think they're all extremely difficult. I must say my own view about the Iraq war at the time was I was against it, not really because I was so concerned about the principles of getting United Nations support and so on. It just seemed to me to be a very risky enterprise, very unclear what the outcome was going to be, unclear what was going to be achieved at the end of the day, and too risky. And I think on the whole that was a good reason for not supporting the war.
Can I just add one point, to take Matthew's point? I think that you have always got to leave open the possibility of very limited interventions. We must never allow, for example, another Srebrenica to occur if we can help it. But what the lesson from Iraq and the subsequent interventions is that these big, large interventions, in the hope that we're going to create a liberal democracy afterwards and all the rest of it, we've got to be very careful about that, because one, we don't have the resources, two, the intelligence is usually poor, and we don't plan thoroughly.
Matthew Daw, since you're outnumbered here 2-1, very brief final word. We've only got half an hour today of the programme, so...
All I would just say is, I think, look, let's look at the substance of the report rather than what John Chilcot has said today, which is more about style than the substance. And let's not forget that in this interview, John Chilcot did say Tony Blair did not depart from the truth, and that is the fundamental before we start setting any other hairs running.
Good to face both ways at once. Thank you both very much.
The controversy surrounding the Iraq war then and now revolves around Tony Blair's role in taking Britain into battle. Today, Sir John Chilcot, the man who led the inquiry about the war, has poured fuel on the argument. Speaking exclusively to the BBC on the first anniversary of his report, he said that Mr. Blair was not straight with the public when he argued so forcefully and emotionally for intervention. Mr. Blair's office has insisted that 5 separate reports, including the Chilcot inquiry, have found that there was no falsifying of the intelligence. Here's our political editor, Laura Koonsberg.
The truth.
Tonight, British servicemen and women are engaged from air, land and sea.
And the whole truth about Britain's war in Iraq.
We will approach our task in a way that is thorough, rigorous, fair.
The man charged with finding it. The man who took us in.
Responsibility, but not a regret for removing Saddam Hussein.
A year since his vast report emerged. Sir John Chilcot's unvarnished view.
Tony Blair is always and ever an advocate. He makes the most persuasive case he can, not departing from the truth, but persuasion is everything. There is, I argued, the responsibility on the leading politician of a government, both to make the case for the policy decision taken, but also to balance that with realism about risks, downsides, counter-arguments. If you act simply as a one-sided advocate, you risk losing that. And I think that risk did come about.
But you spent years studying this intelligence. The way you put it in the report and what you've just said suggests, as somebody who spent their life in government, in public service, that you feel he manipulated the evidence to make his own case.
Again, I'm declining the word manipulate, using as best he could, but it's only fair to him to say that on the very eve of the invasion, he asked the then chair of the Joint Intelligence Committee, can you tell me beyond any reasonable doubt that Saddam has weapons of mass destruction? To which the answer was, yes, I can. He was entitled to rely on that. But would it have been wise to rely on it?
Do you feel he gave you the fullest version of events?
I hesitate to say this rather, but I think it was, from his perspective and standpoint, emotionally truthful. I think he was under very great emotional pressure during those sessions, far more than the committee were. He was suffering, he was deeply engaged.
Just in the most simple terms, do you believe that Tony Blair was as straight with you and the public as he ought to have been?
Can I slightly reword that to say, I think any Prime Minister taking a country into war has got to be straight with the nation and carry it, so far as possible, with him or her. I don't believe that was the case in the Iraq instance.
There were no lies, there was no deceit, there was no deception, but there was a decision.
Sir John didn't then, doesn't now, say Tony Blair intentionally deceived anyone. And the former Prime Minister's friends reject the accusation that he wasn't completely straight.
In the report, he made it clear that Tony Blair did not seek to deceive the public or Parliament, and to use the words he was not straight, it gives a slightly different spin in relation to it. So I think it's unfair and wrong and not justified by the evidence. Good job.
Did he do a good job of our relations with the United States? The inquiry produced dramatic evidence of their close ties.
Our formal policy right up to the autumn of 2002 was one of containment. That was the concluded decision of Cabinet. But the Prime Minister was running one of coercive diplomacy, with the knowledge and support of the Foreign Secretary. But the Foreign Secretary hoped that diplomacy would win and not coercion. I think with the Prime Minister it's probably looked the other way around.
When you saw some of the most notable documents that emerged,
yes,
and I'm thinking of course of the note.
Of course, I shall be with you whatever.
What did you think when you saw that for the first time?
You mustn't say that.
Because?
Because you're giving away far too much. You're making a binding commitment by one sovereign government to another, which you can't fulfil. You're not in a position to fulfil it. I mean, he didn't even know the legal position at that point.
So many documents like this end up simply on the shelf.
Yeah.
But the author this time believes the narrative of Britain's misadventures in Iraq has already changed things.
Do you think we could ever go to war in the same way?
Oh yes, in an existential crisis, certainly, no question about it. But more generally, I think we've seen evidence of, not of a failure of nerve, but of an insistence on much better control of capacity, resources, before reaching a decision to do something on that scale.
The report has brought in a new level of challenge, you believe?
I believe so. In fact, I'm assured so, and hope it's so.
By whom? What assurances have you had?
The rising generations of military.
What about the families?
I was extremely uncertain as to what kind of reception we would get. I didn't know whether you'd get boos or brickbats or even rotten tomatoes. Instead, we got loud applause. Now, the sense of relief I experienced was huge. My hope is that some future minds will have been changed, because you can't just say that block of volumes never existed. It's there now. It's standing in the way of a retreat back down the road to a lesser standard.
Is Sir John Chilcot right to say you weren't straight?
Giving too an intensely detailed postscript to his reputation, built on power, political passion and ambition, defined so much by one decision.
And Laura joins us from Westminster now. Laura, the war was more than a decade ago. Some might be saying, what difference do Sir John Chilcot's comments matter now?
Well, George, remember the decision to go to war in Iraq was one of the most controversial any British Prime Minister had taken for decades. So Sir John's comments today, while they may give rise to some of the familiar criticisms of Tony Blair that we heard from those who opposed the war at the time, they have shed additional insight, not just into what went wrong, but also I think into the psychology around the decision-making process and around the inquiry itself. Now, Tony Blair completely rejects the accusation that somehow he pursued his own version of events. But I think really the broader significance of Sir John's reading of all of this today may well be in terms of what happens if we find ourselves in a similar situation again. What should the responsibilities of not just Number 10, but the MOD, the military, the diplomatic service, the intelligence services, how can they avoid falling short, as they did in many instances in terms of the run-up to and of course the aftermath of the Iraq War? Now, Sir John does believe that there have been some changes already in the last 12 months. But I think his comments today are a very heavy reminder to all institutions in this square mile that they have a responsibility to all of us when it comes to taking the most big and serious decision of all that any government can pursue, to commit forces into a conflict.
Laura, thank you.